Annie Kidder. I'm going to try and talk for 15 minutes at the most so that we can have 15 minutes or maybe even 10 of questions and answers. I'm going to talk about the Drummond Report, but really the overview, as Jackie said, is about how we talk about things that are going on in education. How do we communicate? How do we communicate over the course of the next year where there may be changes, there may be strife. We know there are negotiations going on right now with the teachers. What's that going to mean to all of us in terms of how we communicate about education, and how do we let each other know? And I think it's amazing that this got put together, I just have to say, and that we can have a meeting where there are people in the room and people all over the province at the same time. So to give you a sort of quick recap of Drummond, which is the kind of, the instigator of the conversation. If you could change the slide and change it again. Or you could go back one actually. Don Drummond, who was an economist with TD Bank, was appointed to look at all of Ontario's public services. We have a big deficit. What can we do about it? How do we look at our public services? He put out an incredibly thick report. It had many, many suggestions in it to do with all areas of public services, health, everything that you can think of that governments are in charge of. He did look at it, I think, a lot from the point of view of an economist. So my first kind of caveat is that it's interesting these days that when we are concerned about what we should do about things in public, we have a tendency to ask KPMG or Standard & Poor's or economists, and less of a tendency to ask other kinds of people who are would maybe more look at kind of overall health of society rather than looking at kind of bottom line. I have not read all the other parts of the report. Again, it's many hundreds of pages long. I just looked at the education items in the report. And the other kind of caveat on this, and I think it's, again, this is about the communications. We should all be very careful about getting too het up about what's in the Drummond Report, because a lot of what's there, it's highly unlikely that it will ever be actually implemented. And I talked to one director well before the Drummond Report came out, and she said, this is what's going to happen. We're going to be threatened with, I'm going to smash your skull in, and then when it's only, I'm just going to break your arm, it won't feel so bad. And she predicted that before the Drummond Report came out, and I think that that's kind of true. So there are a lot of really drastic things in the Drummond Report. Everybody got really kind of focused on that, so that when the less drastic things actually happen, everybody will go, oh, well, this isn't so bad. So to just go through a few of the kind of top items in Drummond, which I'm sure most of you have looked at and know, if you could change the slide. One of the things he suggested was cutting full-day kindergarten. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But he also suggested if they're going to go ahead with full-day kindergarten, that they should eliminate the early childhood educators and then cap the class sizes at 20. That nobody has actually talked about that yet. We think that would be a very worrying development, because it would really change the whole purpose of the full-day kindergarten, which was really about early childhood development, play-based learning, and not just about kindergarten, but twice as long. Not twice as much school for 4- and 5-year-olds, but really more recognition of the importance of everything we know about early childhood development. And early childhood educators bring that skill into full-day kindergarten. Among the other things he talked about fees in 2 different areas. He talked about fees for students who take more than 32 credits. Some of his ideas seemed pretty amazing. But there are 3 things about that I think that are important to remember. A, it's not just people going, I'm just going to stay in high school for as long as I want just because it's so much fun. I don't know how many of you have teenagers, but I've had teenagers. They change their minds, or they suddenly realize in grade 12, oh, this really counts. They start to grow up all of a sudden. So it's really important that teenagers have that ability to go back if they suddenly decide that they want to do, oh, I actually want to be a biologist and all I've taken is music. Or I want to go to college and study X or Y and I really needed to study this. We need to give them that chance. And if you make people pay, only then people can afford it pay. So it's important they do change their minds. Some of them don't try at all and suddenly realize they wish they had. And also for kids who are in special education. Many of them have, want to go on to post-secondary education. They may have been taking extra courses every year that count as credits to support them through their journey through high school, and they definitely will want to take a 5th, maybe even a 6th year. They'll end up with more credits, but they need those credits in order to go on to post-secondary. The other area that he suggested charging a fee was for busing. I can't even imagine how that would work. The worry would be that it would be a fee for, say, busing for after-school buses for sports, or fees for perhaps for special programs for which there's busing. I could see people with kids in French immersion being very concerned about that.
It's impossible to imagine fees for busing if you live outside of urban areas, because busing is a core component of school. It is how people access education. He talked about non-teaching staff, and we're going to talk about non-teaching staff at People for Education a lot in our annual report, because we think it's really important to remind people who those people are. He suggested cutting nearly 10,000 non-teaching staff. The impact, again, would probably, for the most part, be on students who might be struggling in school for any number of reasons, but these are educational assistants, child and youth workers, social workers, they're librarians, they're principals, they're secretaries, they're people who keep the schools going and who support students, and they are, again, a core part of education. They're not separate. They're not something, and it was interesting to hear the Premier talk on his YouTube video the other day. He talked about, we won't cut anything inside the classroom. And it's interesting to hear him say that, because those were the exact words of a former government as well. So we need to be careful about making a line between what's inside the classroom and what's outside the classroom.
And I think part of our communications it has to be that everything really is the classroom. And when we start to make those very narrow definitions of what's the classroom and what's not, I mean, what always interested me about what's outside the classroom is the building is outside the classroom, so that you go, the principle is everybody who isn't the teacher and the kids is outside the classroom. He talked about cutting funding for school supplies. Those cuts have already been happening over the last few years in boards. For computers and textbooks and classroom supplies. The worry about that one is that that parents have a tendency to fill in the gaps where they can, but only the parents who can afford it. Again, when we've done our research, we've seen a direct relationship between the finances of the families in the school, what's that called? Income of the families in the school, and the amount that they fundraise. So we really have to be careful about making cuts to things that parents may end up fundraising for. Thank you. There will, I'm sure, be a cap on education spending, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but that was a suggestion of Drummond. He talked about class sizes. And in terms of communicating, again, I think we've struggled with this in People for Education, because we used to demand caps on class sizes, and we used to go, this is really, really important that our class sizes are smaller. Then as we evolved, we started looking at the research, and really Drummond was right about what the research shows, that the effect of a couple of people more or less in a class is very, very limited. So he's suggesting raising the average class sizes slightly. I think that might happen, and I think they might do something about the cap, because it's been very difficult for boards to deal with in grades 1, 2, and 3. One would hope that the money that you save would go back into music teachers and phys ed teachers and teacher librarians, the things that we've lost. That's what you would hope. He talked a lot about First Nations education, which is vital that we address the incredible gap. Kelly Gallagher-Mackay, who's another one of our researchers, sent me, and you maybe too, Carrie, an irate email last night at I don't know what time, going, I'm just reading all this information about Aboriginal education, because everybody says kids on reserve, or that Aboriginal education is funded about $2,000 or $3,000 per pupil less than non-Aboriginal education. And she started to really look at it, and it was making her, as opposed to going, it's really not that bad, she was so angry last night. It was like she wanted to send out a press release right then. So Drummond is right, we do have to look at this. Now, he also, the other interesting parts that are in the Drummond report, there's a whole section on special education. He does talk about the Auditor General's report, which said one of our problems is we still don't have any standards in special education. We know that school boards are spending about $178 million more per year on special ed, than they get from the province. So because they're spending all that money more, they have to take that money from somewhere else. We do not seem to have been able to solve the problem in special education in terms of what are the definitions, what are the programs that really work, how do we best deliver these services. But I didn't feel that Drummond actually understood how special education worked in his description of it. I was very surprised by it, actually. He talked a lot about teachers, their contracts, their pensions, their additional qualifications courses, their sick days. Some of those things are going to come up in the negotiations that are going to happen now, and all of them I would think would be bargaining chips. People for Education will never get involved in that. I think it's very important for us anyway not to take a side, and it's hard in terms of the communication strategy. Getting on a side can get you stuck somewhere that you may want to get unstuck from. In terms of what may actually happen, there will be, I would assume, a 1% cap on increases in spending. That is less than inflation. Hydro costs have been going up about 3%, and anybody who's bought gas lately knows how much gas costs. There are some salaries that go up automatically with or without contract negotiations. So teachers are on a grid. Those salaries are going to go up. It's going to be more than 1%. There are many fixed costs that increase at a higher rate than 1%. So we may see there are school boards, 900 schools are coming online to deliver full-day kindergarten. Nearly all of those schools need renovations or additions in order to deal with the full-day kindergarten. There will be more cuts to school board administration. It's been cut every year for the last 3 years. And those are the ones, when we're talking about education, I think, for me, it comes back to the value of public education, sometimes the value of the investment, that it is really important that we be saying this investment pays off, more than tenfold later on. That we have to be careful that we don't divide classroom and non-classroom. If we cut all the superintendents, for instance, it may sound good in the press because people sort of equate administration and waste, but in fact we need superintendents. We need people to organize our schools. We need people to be looking at the sort of overall system, not just individual schools. So I think that we have to be very, very careful, again, not to, and Fiona Nelson always had the best line, and I think maybe that's something that we can think about, because people will start saying, so, what's an area do you think they could cut? Or what would be your priorities? And her line was, she had two actually. One was, don't make people pick who you're going to throw out of the lifeboat. And her other one was that as the watering holes start shrinking, the animals start looking at each other differently. So we don't want to be pitted against each other either. I'm actually going to talk about I'm going to name a scary one right here. As the funding gets shorter, more and more people go, let's get rid of, all these different school boards we have. Even that one is incredibly divisive. There's no evidence that it saves money anyway. There's lots of evidence that everybody working together across boards, dealing with buildings, ordering things together, having busing together, that saves money. But to say, let's get rid of those Catholic boards or let's get rid of those French boards, that's actually not going to save money, and it's going to make us all fight with each other. So this is not the time, I don't think, and that goes back to the animals starting to look at each other differently. So I think right now what's important is that we all remember the value of public education, the importance of the investment, that we talk to people about how, yes, this is an investment that doesn't pay off in 4 years, it pays off in 20 years. The evidence is very strong that in terms of lower costs on the healthcare system, that one of the biggest determinants of health is education. So the more education you have, the less you use the healthcare system. So we have to keep track of that. We have to talk about how we'll end up with more taxpayers, more engaged citizens, less costs in social services, fewer kids going to jail, if you want to put it really crassly. That's what we have to remember when people say, which they do all the time now, yeah, but we can't afford this, so what are we going to do about it? Is actually to say we must afford this. So I'm going to actually stop there because I assume people are going to ask questions online and live. So Heather Laird from the Ontario Not-for-Profit Network asked, why doesn't getting rid of the 4 different boards save money? And I guess the example I always use is I happen to live in Toronto. And in Toronto, we went through a huge amalgamation process. And the reason for the amalgamation was to save money. And for the city of Toronto, which amalgamated with 5 municipalities, 5 municipalities amalgamated, in fact, costs went up, not down. And the same with the Toronto District School Board, which went from 5 boards to 1. The costs also didn't go down. There are still the same number of students. They still need the same number of principals. They actually still need the same number of superintendents. The infrastructure has to be there. Now, as I said, though, costs can be saved, and we should be looking at this in terms of sharing of buildings, but we should be looking at that. And that's for me, one of the interesting things about Drummond is that he did not talk at all about integration of services. He didn't talk about how we could be doing a better job aligning our mental health programs over here in health and the ones we have in education, or how we deal in healthcare with kids with special needs, and how we could have municipalities working with school boards, Parks and Rec working with school boards. He didn't talk about that at all, but it's in those places that you can save money. But just getting rid of school boards actually doesn't do it.
I just want to read a comment from Mary Lou online. We can do more with less if we look at how we are doing things as opposed to looking at dollars in each area. Perhaps some areas could be combined, perhaps e-textbooks, perhaps shared facilities with the public boards.
I think it's interesting to think about trying to do more with less, but maybe it's not so much trying to do more with less, but trying to do more efficiently, and trying to do more cooperatively, that would make a difference. Yeah.
We're just getting a question from the room here.
Just a further note on that, it's Melanie from OFIA, and really when it comes down to it, if you look across the province, I think a lot of the areas where it is working well are where you see public boards and Catholic boards already sharing busing, sharing, negotiating for services and for materials and things like that, and it is working. And that's where, like Annie just said, the fee sharing and looking at how we can not do more with less, but do things more efficiently.
Just a comment on that. The secondary school in the town in which I live is a shared public Catholic municipal secondary school. So we share all of our services, we share our space, our children, the students in the school share that space, and it's since 2004, and I really believe that that is where there will be great savings when we start to look at how it is that we work better together as opposed to how we don't work at all together. And those sorts of models, it would be nice to see highlighted across the province so the decision makers can see that the models do work and they work well and use it as a best practice.
So Arlene brings up a really important point that right now, if you go to the Ministry of Education to say, I want to build a school as a community hub, they basically go, we build schools, and this is how many square feet you get. And I've always thought there should be a Hubs R Us number you could call for help to put that together, because there are areas. There was one just south of North Bay where they wanted to build a school. All of the communities were consulted. They said what they wanted in the school. It's an area with very low income and no services. But the Ministry of Education, because it's so restricted right now, couldn't help them. It couldn't do what they wanted. There was no way of sharing the financing. And I think that it's a very, that in terms of what we communicate, and it's not a solution to a financial problem, it's actually, it makes better services for families, kids, young people, seniors, because we don't divide into different ministries or different areas or levels of government, and we really need to start to change our thinking about how we provide those.
Patrick Morris from the Ontario Student Trustees Association. I was a product of both Catholic school board systems. I started in the French Catholic school board system, and then moved to the English Catholic school board system. Personally, in both my tenures at different boards, I've noticed there's a strong will within the French board to look at different things from all perspectives. So taking that consideration of an English perspective versus a French perspective, whereas recently in history classes I find it's very much the English versus the French, and I think it's something that really sends a mixed message to a lot of students, and very interesting message as well.
That I went to school, I started school in Quebec, and so I learned Canadian history in Quebec, and then I moved to British Columbia, and it was the opposite. The English were really the bad guys. You know, Montcalm was sneaky, he cheated, that's how he won. I mean, Wolfe, and vice versa in BC. So yes, there is a different perspective that way, but it's important to have all those perspectives.
Katie from Toronto. I just have a general kind of comment. You mentioned that Drummond was from TD Bank, and I find it interesting that it's, okay, sorry, that the whole report kind of rubs me the wrong way. I mean, it sort of embodies this business model with efficiency as being the goal, and it's so narrow a vision. It's like a visionless report. I mean, I just read the education part, so I don't know, maybe it's a grand vision in the rest of it. But I just, sometimes we kind of lose sight of the fact that we're kind of accepting their terms, and I mean, you kind of touched on that a little bit at the beginning. And sorry. And one more specific comment is that his goal seems to be, let's try to preserve all the achievements of the past few years in Ontario, but without cutting whatever we can without affecting those achievements. But achievement is defined so narrowly. It's defined as the EQAO results almost entirely, or I think that's how it's defined anyway. I just wanted to make that point because it seems like we have to, in responding, we're almost like forced to kind of accept the terms, not entirely, but to me, I'd like to not do that.
So I think that that it's very interesting what you're talking about vision, and I think that maybe if we're thinking about kind of key messages, which people like us to think about, that one is that cooperation and that integration of thinking, but the other one I think is vision. People go, oh, vision, that's so boring. But I think in a way that we need to be calling on the government, all of us, our school boards, to have a bigger vision, a more articulated vision that goes beyond, it's very important that our kids do well in reading, writing, and math. That goes without saying, and that more of them graduate. But our vision for education, I would assume, would be bigger, bolder, stronger than that, and involve more just higher goals. And one of the things that we're going to be working on over the next 5 years in People for Education, just to put in an ad, is how we expand our measures of success. Because right now in the popular culture, in the world, in the press, people measure schools by their test scores. We measure the education system by their test scores. So what else can we add to those measures that people can understand, that are simple and clear enough, but that will start to expand our ambition in education because we're measuring those things.
So this is from Mary Lou in London, and she's talking about working together. And I know that Arlene's board and Mary Lou's board, the Thames Valley and the London Catholic, do work very well together. She says, we are even doing our PIC planning together. Oops, and they keep posting more comments, then I have to go back. It's Mary Lou, she's talking again. Okay. We are even doing our PIC planning together, separate parts together. Parents told us we are in the same community. We want to work together. Our school calendars are negotiated together, busing, engagement wherever possible. At the PIC level, sharing has resulted not only in less money being spent, but also expertise and skills.
It's revolutionary.
And Arlene just added that they've done that for years.
All right. I'm Judy Shen, Ontario Student Trustees Association. Okay, so when looking at this reality of how economically there needs to be cuts somewhere, it just looks like that there's an ultimatum between, if we must cut like this, and we must do it like this. Like, I feel like even from a student's perspective, looking at the education system, there's so much reliance on tradition. I'm just wondering why there isn't that thinking of let's try to work this out differently to see if it saves costs, instead of let's cut this and cut this. Like, why is there like this reluctancy to design a more efficient system.
I think that it would be fabulous for the student trustees to actually think about that and think about what are some of the other ways that they would suggest that the education system could work, because I think you're totally right. We get stuck in one way, we get stuck in one form, and we have education, you know, that cliche about the big ship that's hard to turn. Well, education is like that. It's a multi-billion dollar, very old, pretty entrenched system. So we need to hear from students on it, and I think you're exactly right.
I just want to say I feel sorry for the guy, Mr. Don, because he's not the only one behind the report. I'm not in favor of the 100% of the report, but there is another 2 commissioners behind it, and these people are really accountable for their opinion. When we go to the doctor, we have to listen to what he says, or we're going to get more sick. The point is, I really believe what you say. We have legitimate education act in our province, but how they practice, put it in or participate, it's a different story. I don't understand how we can achieve all this achievement if 76 or more % of the total budget is going salary and benefits.
Am I on? I think that one of the things that's important to remember about that is education just is about people. I'm surprised. I think it's actually higher than 76%, because that's what education is. There's nothing else to education except the grown-ups and the students working and learning together. So the other costs, the 20%, are buildings and heat and light, but to think of trying to get that percentage to change so that it was 50% people and 50% hard costs, I think we would be more worried about that. I think that there is incredible skill and expertise involved in teaching and running education systems, which I don't have. I used to be a theater director, and I think that it is important that we pay people who work in education as much or more than we pay firefighters or our police, which is about, and those salaries all live in about the same range. So I do think, I know we hear a lot that it's, you know, 80% of the money goes to salaries, but I can't imagine where else it would go, because that's actually what's going on every day, is teaching and learning, and it's about those people in the room.
Again, I think the thing to note about the salaries as well is to think about, when you think about teachers specifically, or other people who are in the classroom and what they are doing with their time and with their salary. And if you were to look at what they're being paid really, and the amount of time and effort and what they actually put into their work, most or many of the teachers, in terms of, you know, and there's different opinions about this, but when it comes down to it, to a large extent, like, these people are also helping raise our kids. They're not just educating them. So kind of looking at that perspective as well, and, you know, lots of people talk about cutting teacher salaries and that sort of thing, but the contributions that they make are something that really need to be considered beyond just kind of the testing and putting together lesson plans and stuff like that.
Patrick Morris, Ontario Student Trustees Association. I think it's a very good point. Personally, I'll never forget the first time I heard a teacher tell me, you know, you should really pursue a career in politics, and since then it's been full steam ahead. And so, you know, teachers do make a very positive influence on the way we grow and the way we learn. So I definitely agree that they do raise us without really even knowing it.
And if I could just wrap up by going back to, I can't remember your name, to something that Katie said. I think that what's important is that we try to resist getting trapped in just the economic argument and the assumption that we must cut costs. There is a revenue problem. It's not very popular, but there have been billions of dollars of tax cuts, which is part of the reason why the tax cuts actually kind of amazingly equal the deficit we have right now. It's about $16 billion. So I think it's important that we try and spread the word that there is this incredible value that it's worth paying for, that we acknowledge it's very expensive, but that when we all pay a little bit, collectively, it makes the pot very, very big. So that when it's the argument between I want to pay $100 less a year in taxes, that $100 less a year means, you know, fewer educational assistants for kids in special ed, and that's the way you have to put it. You know, which thing are we going to decide is too expensive to pay for? And I think it's really important to really strongly, bravely talk about that piece in terms of how we talk about education going forward, because people are going to be looking at it, and people, I mean, I've been doing interviews, it's like, where can we cut? This was a great discussion, and maybe we can keep on having it. Thank you, everybody.